Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The coal-dusted town of Millwood rested in a narrow valley of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where shadows lingered even at midday beneath the steep walls of densely forested slopes. In the autumn of 1911, when the maple leaves turned blood red and the morning fog clung to the hollows like a shroud, the town newspaper reported the disappearance of Thomas Whitley, a young accountant employed by the Fairchild Mining Company. The official account stated that Whitley had simply walked away from his position, abandoning his ledgers and boarding a train eastbound without notice. The report occupied merely 3 inches of column space on the 5th page, sandwiched between advertisements for liver pills and women's corsets. What made this unremarkable disappearance noteworthy was not what appeared in those 3 inches of newsprint, but what had been meticulously omitted. Thomas Whitley was the 7th man to vanish from the employ of Fairchild Mining in 18 months. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern. A clerk or accountant who had access to the company's financial records would fail to report to work. A day later, personal effects would be found packed, lodgings vacated, with rumors of unpaid debts or family emergencies circulating through the town's grapevine. No forwarding addresses were ever provided. No correspondence was ever received from these men again. The regional inspector's office maintained a thin file on these cases, labeled simply, Employment Terminations, Fairchild Brothers Coal Operations. The file contained depositions from Harold and Edgar Fairchild attesting to the voluntary departure of each man. The inspector's handwritten notes in the margin of Whitley's case read only, Subject prone to melancholy. Personal finances in disarray. No evidence of foul play. The file was archived on November 12, 1911. What remained unwritten was the testimony of Eleanor Whitley, who insisted her husband had been in unusually high spirits in the days before his disappearance. According to accounts collected by a former deputy sheriff in 1918, Mrs. P. Whitley claimed Thomas had mentioned discovering discrepancies in the company's accounting that would set things right for the miners. This statement was never entered into official records. The story of the Fairchild brothers and their coal empire might have remained buried in those dusty files if not for what occurred on February 3, 1919, when heavy spring rains caused a catastrophic collapse of an abandoned mine shaft on the eastern ridge of Millwood Valley. What workers discovered in the darkness below would forever change how the residents of Millwood viewed the imposing Victorian mansion that stood on the hill overlooking their town, the residence of Harold and Edgar Fairchild. The Fairchild brothers were not native to West Virginia. They had arrived in 1897 from Philadelphia, purchasing struggling mining operations with family money and rapidly expanding their holdings throughout the southern counties. Unlike many absentee owners, the Fairchilds chose to establish their residence directly in the mining town, constructing an ostentatious home on Blackwood Ridge, with views of both the company operations and the rows of miners' homes below. Harold, the elder brother, managed the company's finances and public affairs. Tall and rail-thin with a meticulously groomed beard, he was known for his precise manner of speech and formal attire, regardless of occasion or weather. Edgar, younger by 3 years, oversaw the day-to-day operations of the mines. Stockier than his brother and clean-shaven, Edgar was more frequently seen in the town, inspecting shipments or consulting with foremen. Both were bachelors. Both attended the Presbyterian church in town every Sunday. Both maintained a polite but unmistakable distance from the local population. They weren't cruel men, not in the usual way, recalled Martin Hollister, a former mine supervisor interviewed in 1932. They paid better wages than most operations in the county. The company store charged fair prices. Safety conditions were better than most. But there was something not right about them. the way they'd watch the miners. Like they were studying animals in a zoo. The Fairchild Mining Company employed over 300 men by 1910, with operations spanning 4 mines. The brothers had expanded beyond simple extraction, constructing a small coke works and securing favorable contracts with the railroad. Their success was attributed to shrewd business practices and technological innovation. Local newspapers praised them as model industrialists, bringing prosperity to the region. Yet among the miners, whispered stories circulated of a different nature. The old-timers wouldn't go near the east shaft, said Thomas Jenkins, who began working in the mines at age 14 in 1909, called it the threshold, said if you listened close enough, you could hear men crying deep in the earth, men who weren't there. I thought it was just ghost stories to scare the new boys. Wish to God it had been. The east shaft was among the oldest in the valley, begun before the Civil War, and expanded haphazardly over decades. By 1911, official company records showed that section had been deemed unprofitable and sealed off. Mining operations had shifted to more productive seams to the north and west. The east shaft was removed from maps, its entrances boarded and marked as condemned. For 8 years, it remained undisturbed until the rains came in the early spring of 1919. 3 days of torrential downpour saturated the mountainside. Shortly before dawn on February 3rd, residents of Lower Millwood were awakened by a sound that one witness described as the mountain itself groaning in pain. A section of the ridge face had collapsed, exposing the sealed workings of the east shaft and sending a torrent of mud, timber, and coal waste into the valley below. As the company organized recovery efforts, a team of workers was dispatched to assess the damage to the old mine workings. Their instructions were simple: determine if the collapse threatened the structural integrity of the active mining operations. What they found defied simple explanation. The sealed shaft didn't lead to abandoned coal works, as the maps indicated. Instead, it connected to something the miners could only describe as a prison built in hell itself. Matthew Collins led the assessment team that day. His sworn statement given to county officials described corridors of carefully constructed cells dug into the living rock, reinforced with timber and iron. These cells, small, airless chambers barely tall enough for a man to stand, lined a central shaft that descended vertically into darkness. The team counted 23 distinct cells before refusing to venture deeper. They weren't mining chambers, Collins testified. They were built to hold men. Each had iron rings fixed to the walls where chains could be attached. The floors were grooved toward the center like drains. And the walls? Here, the official transcript notes. Collins became too disturbed to continue for several minutes before adding, the walls had marks, tallies, like men counting days. Hundreds upon hundreds of marks. When asked if they found any human remains, Collins' response was entered into record simply as, "Not intact ones, sir." The discovery sent ripples of horror through Millwood. The county sheriff organized a larger expedition into the exposed shaft the following day, accompanied by a physician and a photographer from the newspaper. Before they could begin their documentation, however, company lawyers arrived with an injunction from a judge in the neighboring county, prohibiting entry on grounds of corporate property rights and safety concerns. That night, as legal battles ensued, witnesses reported unusual activity at the Fairchild mansion. Lights burned in every window until dawn, and servants were seen carrying trunks and boxes to waiting carriages. By morning, when the sheriff arrived with federal authorities who superseded the local injunction, the mansion stood empty. The Fairchild brothers, along with their personal staff, had vanished. What followed was one of the most exhaustive criminal investigations in West Virginia's history, though much of it was conducted in secret. The east shaft was fully excavated under federal supervision. Company records were seized from offices. Former employees were questioned. The full findings were never made public, sealed by court order in 1920 after the state legislature passed a resolution citing potential damage to the region's industrial reputation and the ongoing need for coal production in the national interest. However, fragments of the investigation surfaced through various sources over subsequent years. A partial inventory from the mine excavation listed surgical implements of unusual design, recording equipment with wax cylinders, and journals containing detailed anatomical observations. The former company physician, when interviewed by authorities, claimed no knowledge of any medical experimentation, but admitted to ordering unusual quantities of chloroform, morphine, and various restraints at Mr. Harold's periodic request. Most disturbing were the partial records recovered from a hidden room in the mansion's basement, meticulously maintained ledgers documenting subjects, procedures, and durations. These coded entries corresponded precisely with the dates of the mysterious disappearances that had occurred over the years. Thomas Whitley's name appeared as Subject 49, with an entry dated the day before he was reported missing. Subject exhibited unusual resistance to stimulus B17. Cognitive functions remained intact for 47 minutes despite severe systemic shock. Procedure terminated when subject's cardiac rhythm became unstable. The Fairchild brothers themselves were never found. A nationwide alert yielded reported sightings from New Orleans to Seattle, but none were confirmed. In 1920, a steamship passenger manifest included names matching their aliases known to investigators on a vessel bound for Argentina. No further trace of them was ever officially documented. The abandoned mansion remained empty for decades, avoided by locals who claimed to hear screams echoing from its walls on particularly quiet nights. The mining operations were eventually acquired by a larger corporation, which sealed the east shaft permanently under tons of concrete in 1925. The company records cited geological instability, but miners spoke of other reasons. They buried it because what happened there was still happening, claimed William Porter, one of the last living miners from that era, interviewed in 1968. That place wasn't just where men died. It was where something unnatural was born. The Fairchilds may have gone, but they left something behind in those tunnels, something that feeds on pain. For nearly a century, the story of the Fairchild brothers faded from public knowledge, their crimes too horrific to be commemorated, their legacy too disturbing to be studied. Official history reduced them to merely another example of absentee mine owners who exploited the region. The true nature of what transpired beneath Millwood remained known only to those who had seen the chambers firsthand, their nightmares carrying the truth to their graves, until now. In the winter of 1917, as the nation's attention focused on the war in Europe, a geology student from the University in Morgantown arrived in Millwood to conduct research on coal seam formations. Julian Harker came with academic credentials and letters of introduction to the current mine operators. He was granted limited access to survey the active workings, but was explicitly forbidden from approaching the sealed east shaft. The locals wouldn't speak about the Fairchilds at first, Harker wrote in his private correspondence to his professor. When I inquired about the abandoned mansion or the sealed mine shaft, conversations would abruptly terminate. It was as if the entire town was bound by some unspoken pact of silence. Only after gaining the trust of an elderly clerk at the county records office did I begin to uncover fragments of the truth. The clerk, Samuel Tanner, had been employed as a junior administrator in the mine office during the Fairchild's ownership. Though he had no direct knowledge of their clandestine activities, he had observed patterns that troubled him even decades later. Mystery. Harold had peculiar requirements for hiring office staff, Tanner told Harker. He insisted on interviewing every candidate personally, regardless of position. He would ask strange questions about their family connections, their tolerance for solitude, whether they were prone to headaches or had ever experienced seizures. At the time, I attributed this to simple eccentricity. Now I understand he was screening for experimental subjects. Through careful examination of property records, employment logs, and newspaper archives, Harker reconstructed a timeline of disappearances extending far beyond the 7 cases officially attributed to the Fairchilds. Between 1897 and 1919, He identified 31 individuals who had vanished from the region under suspicious circumstances. Most were single men with minimal family connections, traveling salesmen, itinerant workers, drifters seeking employment, perfect subjects who wouldn't be extensively searched for. What's most disturbing, Harker wrote, is the methodical progression evident in their selection. The earliest disappearances involved social outcasts, men already on society's margins. As years passed, the Fairchilds grew bolder, targeting individuals of increasingly respectable standing. By 1911, they had developed such confidence in their system that they began taking their own employees, men whose absences would inevitably raise questions. It suggests not only escalating psychological compulsion, but a growing sense of invulnerability. Harker's research took an unexpected turn when he discovered a connection between the Fairchilds and an obscure medical journal published in Philadelphia. 3 articles appearing between 1904 and 1908 described experimental procedures involving pain thresholds and cognitive endurance. Though authored under the pseudonym H.F. Blackwood, the writing style and specific terminology matched private correspondence from Harold Fairchild that Harker had found in the county archives. The articles described experiments aimed at measuring how long human consciousness could endure under extreme conditions. The stated purpose was to advance understanding of surgical shock and trauma recovery. But the methods detailed went far beyond acceptable medical practice of the era. Most disturbing was the author's clinical detachment, describing human suffering with the dispassionate tone of a man observing chemical reactions. The subject's vocalizations followed predictable patterns, read one passage, beginning with structured pleas and coherent bargaining, progressing to nonverbal expressions of distress, and ultimately arriving at a state of transcendent dissociation where consciousness appeared to separate from physical stimuli. It is in this final phase that the most illuminating observations can be made regarding the durability of human awareness. The journal ceased publication in 1909 after a review by the Medical Association questioned its experimental methodologies. By then, the Fairchilds had apparently turned their attention fully to their private underground laboratory, where no ethics committee would monitor their work. Harker became obsessed with understanding the brothers' motivations. His research led him to earlier records from Philadelphia, where he discovered that Harold Fairchild had briefly attended medical school before being dismissed under undisclosed circumstances. Edgar had studied engineering but developed a particular interest in mining operations after touring a Pennsylvania coal mine where 3 men had been trapped for 17 days following a collapse. The brothers appear to have developed a shared fascination with human endurance under extreme conditions, Harker wrote. Harold approached it from a physiological perspective, Edgar from an environmental one. Their coal operations provided both the perfect cover and the perfect setting for their true interest, the systematic study of how long the human spirit could endure when hope was removed entirely. What remains unclear is how the brothers managed to construct their underground chambers without arousing suspicion among their workforce. Company records show frequent rotation of mining crews in the East Shaft area between 1899 and 1907, with no crew working there longer than 3 weeks before being reassigned. The construction was likely completed in segments, with workers unaware of the overall design. They compartmentalized knowledge, explained Thomas Jenkins, who had worked as a young loader during that period. One crew would dig a side tunnel, thinking it was exploration for new coal seams. Another would reinforce chambers they were told would be used for equipment storage. The overall plan was known only to Edgar and his most trusted foreman, a man named Charles Blackwell, who vanished shortly after the brothers fled. Rumor was that Blackwell knew too much to be allowed to remain behind. Harker's investigation took its darkest turn when he gained access to fragments of the brothers' research notes through a former house servant who had salvaged papers from a burning barrel the night of their disappearance. These partially burned documents revealed the true nature of the experiments conducted in the underground chambers. a systematic exploration of isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological breaking points. Subject 37 maintained coherent speech patterns for 9 days when deprived of light and sound, read one notation. Auditory hallucinations began on day 4, but were recognized as unreal until day 7. Subject exhibited remarkable adaptation to temporal disorientation, creating an internal clock based on systematic physical exercises. Method shows promise. Recommendation: add periodic but unpredictable stimuli to disrupt adaptive patterns. Another entry was more disturbing. When confronted with evidence that search efforts have been abandoned, subjects typically progress through denial, rage, bargaining, and acceptance within 36 to 48 hours. The introduction of false hope, sounds of rescue operations, distant voices, scraping against walls, followed by prolonged silence, accelerates psychological deterioration significantly. Repeated cycles produce increasingly severe dissociative states. The fragments painted a picture of methodical cruelty beyond simple sadism. The Fairchilds weren't merely torturing victims for personal gratification. They were conducting what they viewed as scientific research into the limits of human psychological endurance. They created conditions of absolute hopelessness, then meticulously documented the stages of mental disintegration that followed. Perhaps most chilling was their apparent goal. In one partially legible note, Harold Fairchild wrote, "We are approaching the threshold where consciousness separates from physical constraints. The moment of transcendence E witnessed in Subject 29 suggests the possibility of accessing heightened states through systematic breakdown of normal psychological boundaries. If replicated and properly documented, this could represent the most significant advancement in understanding the human mind since..." The remainder of the page was burned away, leaving the brothers' ultimate purpose unclear. But surviving subjects' cells contained unusual markings scratched into the walls, not just tallies marking days, but elaborate, almost geometric patterns that became more complex in cells where longer confinements had occurred. These markings bore striking resemblances to drawings produced by patients in psychiatric institutions who reported mystical visions or communication with non-human entities. The Fairchilds believed they were opening doorways, claimed Harker in his final letter before abandoning his research. Not physical doorways, but portals within the human mind. They theorized that by systematically dismantling a person's psychological defenses through isolation, pain, and hopelessness, they could access something beyond normal consciousness. The question that haunts me is not what they did to their victims, horrific as that was, but what they may have allowed into our world through their experiments. Harker abruptly departed Millwood in early 1918, leaving his research materials with Samuel Tanner. His final communication, a telegram to his professor, read only, "Returning immediately, burn my previous correspondence. Some doorways should remain closed." He never returned to the university. Inquiries tracked him to Pittsburgh, where he checked into a hotel under an assumed name and then vanished. His name appears on no subsequent census records, military registrations, or death certificates. Like the Fairchild subjects, Julian Harker simply disappeared. Samuel Tanner, the elderly clerk who had assisted Harker, died in his sleep 3 weeks after the researcher's departure. The official cause was listed as heart failure, though the doctor who examined him noted unusual contusions on his wrists and ankles, consistent with restraints, and a peculiar expression of terror fixed on the deceased's face. The collapse of the East Shaft in 1919 and the subsequent investigation briefly brought the Fairchild's crimes into public view, but the authorities' decision to seal the records ensured the full scope would never be widely known. The few officials and workers who had ventured into the underground chambers rarely spoke of what they'd seen. Those who did reported recurring nightmares and unexplained physical symptoms, chronic headaches, tremors, sudden episodes of dissociation. "It wasn't just what we found there," said Matthew Collins, who led the initial assessment team. "It was what found us. Something followed us out of those tunnels. Sometimes at night I feel it standing beside my bed, watching, waiting. The Fairchilds opened something down there that shouldn't have been opened, and it's still open, even with all that concrete poured over it. The current owners of the mining operation, who acquired the property in 1947, maintain that the east shaft area is permanently sealed and poses no safety risk. Company spokesperson Jennifer Reynolds stated in 1982, "The geological instability in that section makes it unsuitable for mining operations. The concrete barrier is regularly inspected and remains intact. Stories about its history are exaggerated folklore typical of mining communities. Yet even today, miners refuse to work in the tunnels nearest the sealed section. Equipment malfunctions are common in that area. Workers report sudden cold spots, unexplained sounds, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Geological microphones placed to monitor seismic activity have occasionally recorded what technicians describe as sounds resembling human vocalizations emanating from beyond the concrete barrier, though officials attribute this to wind movements through natural rock fissures. The Fairchild Mansion was finally demolished in 1963 to make way for a company administrative building. During excavation of the foundation, workers discovered a previously unknown sub-basement containing a small room lined with copper sheeting. At its center stood a strange apparatus resembling a medical examination chair surrounded by what appeared to be early audio recording equipment. Before the discovery could be properly documented, a mysterious fire broke out, destroying the evidence and killing 2 workers. The fire was officially attributed to a ruptured gas line, but rumors persisted among local residents that company officials had deliberately destroyed the site to prevent renewed interest in the Fairchild case. The administrative building project was abandoned, and the property remains an empty lot overgrown with blackberry brambles and stunted pine trees. Local children dare each other to spend nights there, but inevitably flee before midnight, claiming to hear whispers emanating from the ground beneath them. In 1971, an elderly man checking into a Buenos Aires hospital for treatment of advanced liver failure claimed to be Edgar Fairchild. He died before authorities could verify his identity, but among his personal effects was a leather-bound journal containing detailed observations of subjects dated as recently as 1962. Argentine police investigated a remote estate in Patagonia registered to a Harold Blackwood but found it abandoned and partially burned. Local residents reported that 2 elderly American brothers had lived there in seclusion for decades, occasionally bringing in workers from distant towns who were never seen leaving the property. Whether the Fairchild brothers continued their experiments until their deaths remains unconfirmed. What is certain is that the legacy of their work persists in Millwood. The town never fully recovered its prosperity after the scandal. The population dwindled as miners sought work elsewhere, away from the shadow of the sealed east shaft. Those who remained passed down warnings through generations to avoid the ridge after dark, to ignore voices calling your name from the direction of the abandoned mansion site, and never to follow the occasional lights seen moving deep in the woods where the old mine entrances had been. "This place has a sickness in it," said Eleanor Jenkins, granddaughter of Thomas Jenkins, in a 2009 interview for a local history project. "Not in the land itself, but in the air, in the silence between words. The Fairchilds brought something here that never left. You can feel it watching, waiting for another chance. Some nights, when the wind blows just right, you can hear it calling from underground, not with human voices, but with something that only pretends to be human." The official records of the Fairchild case remain sealed in state archives, classified under national security provisions dating back to 1920. Periodic requests for their release under Freedom of Information laws have been consistently denied, citing ongoing sensitivity and potential public harm. The most recent denial, issued in 2011, included the unusual justification that certain historical events are best left undisturbed for the general welfare. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps some chapters of history should remain closed, some doors should stay locked, some names should never be spoken aloud. The Fairchild brothers may have died decades ago, but in the quiet hollows of Millwood, residents still cross themselves when passing the overgrown lot where the mansion stood, still avoid the eastern ridge, where concrete seals, ancient tunnels, still whisper warnings to children who wander too close to the woods at dusk. For in those dark chambers beneath the earth, where men were systematically stripped of hope until only raw consciousness remained, something was born that transcends physical containment, something that waits in the spaces between heartbeats, in the shadows between thoughts, in the silent moments between words, something that the Fairchild brothers called the threshold state, the point where the human mind, faced with unbearable reality, creates doorways to somewhere else. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, those doorways still open. In the autumn of 1916, as American attention increasingly focused on the war in Europe, a physician named Dr. James Callaway arrived in Millwood. His stated purpose was to establish a practice serving the mining community, a noble endeavor welcomed by residents who had limited access to medical care. What few knew was that Callaway had been drawn to the region by correspondence with an anonymous source who claimed to possess revolutionary research on the limits of human consciousness. Dr. Callaway had a respectable medical background, educated at Johns Hopkins, published in reputable journals, with a brief tenure at a Philadelphia hospital. His credentials were impeccable. Yet his career had stalled after proposing controversial theories about consciousness persisting after clinical death, ideas that alienated him from mainstream medicine. The promise of undocumented research that might validate his theories proved irresistible. "I came seeking scientific validation," Callaway wrote in his journal. "I found instead a descent into methodical madness disguised as empirical inquiry. God help me for the part I almost played in it." His first meeting with Harold Fairchild occurred 3 weeks after establishing his practice in Millwood. Invited to dinner at the mansion on the ridge, Callaway was initially impressed by his host's medical knowledge and apparent scientific rigor. Harold spoke of experiments conducted in absolute secrecy, away from the moral limitations imposed by conventional institutions. He presented himself as a misunderstood visionary, Callaway recorded. He spoke of consciousness as a fluid that could be distilled through specific processes, separated from its physical vessel, and perhaps transferred. At the time, his theories aligned with my own speculative work. I was blind to the horror behind his intellectual facade. Over subsequent meetings, Harold gradually revealed more about the brothers' work, describing their underground laboratory as a controlled environment for consciousness studies. He showed Callaway fragmentary records of experiments, carefully selected to omit the most disturbing elements, while highlighting observations that would intrigue the physician. What Harold sought was not merely an audience for their work, but a trained medical professional who could help refine their methods. The brothers had reached an impasse in their research. Subjects were transcending, as they termed it, reaching states of consciousness beyond normal parameters, but the brothers lacked the medical expertise to properly document and analyze these states. Callaway, with his background in consciousness studies, was the perfect collaborator. "I was flattered by his interest," Callaway confessed, "seduced by the prospect of validating my theories. When he first proposed showing me their facility, I eagerly accepted. May God forgive my blindness." Harold arranged for Callaway to visit what he called their observation chambers on October 7, 1916. The entrance was concealed within a storage building at the mine's administrative complex, accessible via a private elevator that descended deep below the active mining levels. Callaway described the facility as immaculately maintained, more resembling a hospital ward than a mine shaft, with electric lighting, ventilation systems, and metal doors lining a central corridor. What transpired during that visit caused Callaway to flee Millwood the following day. His journal entry, written from a hotel room in Charleston, trembles with horror, even on the page. They were not conducting research. They were systematically destroying human minds to see what remained when all hope, All identity, all connection to reality, had been stripped away. The subject I witnessed, a man they referred to only as 53, had been confined in absolute darkness for what Harold casually mentioned was approximately 47 days. When they opened the viewing panel, the man was hunched in the corner, emaciated, yet somehow vibrating with unnatural energy. His eyes reflected the light in a manner I cannot properly describe, not merely dilated from darkness, but somehow altered in their fundamental character. Harold spoke to him through an apparatus not kindly, but in a clinical manner, asking questions about what he was seeing and who was speaking to him. The man responded not to Harold, but to some presence invisible to us, carrying on a conversation with emptiness, his head nodding and tilting as though tracking movement through the air. Edgar recorded the session with a phonograph device, occasionally making notations while Harold continued questioning. They treated the entire scenario with such clinical detachment that it took several minutes for me to fully comprehend what I was witnessing: the systematic destruction of a human mind through isolation and psychological torture, presented as scientific research. When I expressed horror, Harold seemed genuinely perplexed by my reaction. "We are merely accelerating a natural process," he explained. "All consciousness eventually separates from physical form. We are documenting the transition." He then invited me to observe subjects in various stages of the process, as though offering a tour of botanical specimens. I made excuses and left as quickly as decorum allowed, but not before glimpsing additional chambers through partially opened doors. The sounds emanating from those rooms will haunt me until my dying day. Not screams of pain or terror, but something worse: the sound of human voices speaking in conversational tones with entities that could not possibly be present. I am leaving for Washington immediately to alert federal authorities. Whatever the Fairchilds believe they are doing, whatever they believe they are finding in the broken minds of their victims, it represents a corruption of science and humanity that cannot be permitted to continue. Callaway did indeed travel to Washington, where records show he met with Justice Department officials on October 12th. However, his allegations were deemed fantastical and without substantiating evidence. With American attention focused on the European conflict and coal production considered essential to national interests, there was little appetite for investigating respected industrialists based on seemingly outlandish claims. Frustrated by official inaction, Callaway returned to West Virginia determined to gather evidence. He took a room in a boarding house in Charleston and began interviewing former Fairchild employees, families of missing persons, and anyone with connections to Millwood. His notes from this period show increasing paranoia, references to being followed, strange telephone calls ending in silence, and unfamiliar men observing his movements. On November 3rd, Callaway traveled back to Millwood, telling his landlady he had arranged to meet a former mine foreman who knew where the bodies were buried. He never returned to his boarding house. His personal effects were found in his room, including his journal, which ended abruptly with his account of the underground facility. No trace of Callaway was ever officially discovered. However, when the east shaft collapsed in 1919 and the chambers were partially exposed, workers reported finding a doctor's medical bag wedged behind a false wall in one of the deeper corridors. The identification inside read, "James Callaway, M.D." The bag contained standard medical implements, alongside a small notebook filled with observations written in increasingly erratic handwriting. The final entry read only, "They have placed me with subject 57. Harold says I will understand better from this perspective. The door is sealed. Something is in here with me. It speaks with my mother's voice." This notebook never entered official evidence. The worker who discovered it, Joseph Miller, kept it hidden, believing authorities were suppressing the full truth of the Fairchild case. Miller's grandson, Michael, donated the notebook to a private collection of Appalachian historical artifacts in 1978. where it remained largely forgotten until historian Patricia Welch discovered it while researching mining conditions in 2003. Welch's attempts to authenticate the notebook and publicize its contents met with unexpected resistance from both academic institutions and government agencies. Her research funding was abruptly canceled, her academic position threatened, and her home broken into twice with only her research materials taken. She eventually abandoned the project after receiving anonymous threats against her family. "I hit a nerve with the Fairchild material," she told a colleague, before relocating to Canada. "There's something about this case that certain people are still actively suppressing, a century later. It's as if they're afraid of what might happen if the full story became known." The most disturbing aspect of the Callaway notebook was not the description of the brothers' methods, horrific as they were, but the physician's progressive documentation of what the Fairchilds called threshold phenomena, inexplicable events that occurred around subjects who had endured extended periods of isolation and psychological breakdown. According to Callaway's observations, subjects confined beyond approximately 30 days began experiencing consistent hallucinations that showed alarming commonalities. They described voices speaking in identical phrases, entities that manifested in identical forms, and geometric patterns that they felt compelled to recreate on walls or floors. More disturbing were the documented physical phenomena: temperature fluctuations, unusual light manifestations, and electronically recorded sounds that Callaway described as languages never spoken by human tongues. The brothers believed they weren't destroying minds but transforming them, creating conditions where normal psychological barriers dissolved, allowing consciousness to perceive aspects of reality normally filtered out by the human brain. They viewed their work not as torture, but as evolution, forcing human perception beyond its natural limitations, regardless of the cost to their subjects. The notebooks contained references to the threshold entity, something that the brothers believed existed at the boundary between normal consciousness and whatever lay beyond. In subjects approaching complete psychological dissolution, this entity would apparently make itself known, first through dreams, then through waking visions, and finally through what Callaway described as partial manifestation in physical space. Subject 53 described it as wearing a face made of shifting smoke, Callaway wrote. Subject 49 called it the patient visitor. Subject 51 would only refer to it as the waiting one. All reported that it asked questions about our world, our limitations, our understanding of reality. All felt it was learning from them, preparing for something. In his final entries, Callaway's scientific skepticism gave way to mounting dread. "I no longer believe these are hallucinations," he wrote. The consistency across subjects who have no contact with each other defies explanation. The brothers have found something, or rather, something has found them. It uses the broken minds of their subjects as windows, looking through from somewhere else. And recently, I fear, it has begun finding ways to open those windows wider. After the federal investigation in 1919, all materials related to the underground chambers were supposedly destroyed or sealed in government archives. The chambers themselves were filled with concrete, the entrance shafts collapsed and buried. The official explanation given to the public focused on unsafe mining practices and possible fraud rather than the true nature of the Fairchild's activities. Yet stories persisted among those who had been involved in the investigation. Federal agent Thomas Blackwood, who supervised the sealing of the chambers, requested transfer immediately afterward and later resigned from government service entirely. Before his death in 1941, he confided to his son that the team had found something moving in the darkest chamber when they breached the final door, something that wore a human shape but moved wrong, like it was still learning how. The team fled, sealing the chamber without fully documenting its contents. Blackwood insisted that the concrete barrier was not to keep people out, but to keep something in. He spent the remainder of his life checking newspaper reports from West Virginia, particularly articles about missing persons or unusual deaths in the Millwood region. The official closure of the case did little to heal the community. Millwood's population declined steadily in subsequent decades as mining operations were consolidated and mechanization reduced workforce needs. By 1960, it had become a shadow of its former self, a half-abandoned town, where remaining residents spoke little of its history and discouraged outside inquiry. Yet the legacy of the Fairchilds manifested in subtle ways. Millwood has maintained an unusually high rate of mental health issues compared to similar communities in the region. Local physicians have noted a statistically significant pattern of sleep disorders, particularly a condition where patients report waking to find someone sitting at the foot of their bed, watching them with eyes like smoke. The county maintains no official records about the Fairchild case in its historical archives. The section of local history covering 1897 through 1920 contains only generic information about mining development and economic data. When questioned about this omission, county historian Margaret Wells explained simply, "Some stories are best left untold. Some names are best left unspoken. The people who lived through those times understood that." Perhaps the most disturbing postscript to the Fairchild case emerged in 1974, when construction workers excavating for a highway expansion near the former site of the brothers' mansion uncovered a sealed underground chamber containing hundreds of wax cylinder recordings. These were quickly confiscated by unidentified federal agents, but not before a local reporter heard portions of one cylinder. It contained a voice speaking in a clinical, detached manner about progress with Subject 60, reported James Harrison of the Millwood Gazette. What disturbed me most was not the content, but the date mentioned in the recording, April 1963, more than 40 years after the Fairchild supposedly disappeared. Harrison's article never went to print. The newspaper's editor claimed the story lacked verification. Harrison was fired the following week. He continued investigating independently until his fatal car accident 6 months later, which local police attributed to icy road conditions despite occurring in August. The final mystery of the Fairchild case may be the most unsettling, the fate of their subjects. Official records acknowledge only 17 confirmed victims, but researchers like Julian Harker and Patricia Welch estimated the actual number exceeded 60. Of these remains were recovered for fewer than a dozen. The others simply vanished, their final moments unrecorded except in the brothers' coded journals. Yet periodically across decades, residents of communities throughout the region have reported encounters with strange, solitary individuals who exhibited unusual behavior, maintaining unblinking eye contact, speaking in oddly formal patterns, asking peculiar questions about human emotions or sensory experiences. These individuals typically disappeared after a few days, leaving no trace of their presence. In 1992, a hospice nurse in Charleston documented the final words of an elderly homeless man who claimed to have been Subject 41 in the Fairchild chambers. According to her notes, the man spoke lucidly about being imprisoned underground for time beyond counting, before being selected for continuation. His final statement was recorded as, "They think they're studying us, but we're studying them, learning how to be them. The threshold works both ways. They open the door, but they don't control what comes through. It's been patient, so patient, but it's almost ready now." The nurse reported the conversation to her supervisor, noting the man's hospital identification listed him as 73 years old, too young to have been a victim of the Fairchilds in the 1910s. The records were subsequently altered to indicate the patient had been suffering from late-stage dementia. His statements classified as delusional. Today, Millwood exists only as a footnote in West Virginia's mining history. The town was officially unincorporated in 1997, its remaining structures demolished for environmental remediation of the abandoned mine sites. The ridge where the Fairchild mansion once stood has been reclaimed by forest, indistinguishable from the surrounding Appalachian wilderness. Yet locals avoid the area, particularly after dark. Hunters report an unnatural silence in those woods. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through leaves. Electronic devices malfunction. Compasses spin uselessly. GPS systems show impossible coordinates. Those who venture deeper describe an increasing sense of being observed by something just beyond visual perception. Whatever the Fairchild started didn't end when they disappeared, said Michael Miller, grandson of the worker who found Callaway's notebook. They broke something that shouldn't have been broken, opened something that should have stayed closed. The concrete might contain it physically, but some doors can't be sealed once they're opened. The most recent documented incident connected to the case occurred in 2011, when a caving expedition unrelated to mining accidentally discovered a narrow fissure leading to a previously unknown section of the underground complex. Before authorities sealed the area, the cavers reported finding a chamber containing a single chair facing a blank wall. On the wall, a message was written in what appeared to be dried blood. "We are the door. We have always been the door. And now it is opening." The message was photographed by one team member, but the image showed only a blank wall when developed. All 6 members of the caving team subsequently died under various circumstances within a year, 3 in accidents, 2 by suicide, and 1 from a previously undiagnosed brain condition that caused hallucinations of smoke-faced figures standing at the foot of his hospital bed. The Fairchild case remains officially closed, the brothers' fate unknown, their work buried beneath tons of concrete and decades of intentional obfuscation. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some chapters of human history should remain unexamined, some questions unanswered. For in the quiet hollows of West Virginia, in the shadows of mountains that have witnessed humanity's darkest impulses, something waits. Something that was given a glimpse of our world through the broken minds of the brothers' victims. Something that learned patience from those who had all hope systematically stripped away. The Fairchild sought to document how long human consciousness could endure when isolated from all comfort, all connection, all reason to continue. They meticulously recorded the stages of psychological disintegration, believing they were observing the separation of mind from body, of consciousness from physical form. What they failed to consider was what might fill the void left behind when a human mind has been systematically emptied of everything that makes it human, and whether that emptiness was watching them all along.